are going to get going here. We've overcome our technical challenge, and Director Pinsky, former Senator Pinsky, welcome back to your old committee room. And so you've got a slide presentation. Who do you have with you? We can introduce your team.
I'm joined by Ryan Opsel, who's my Director of Policy at the Maryland Energy Administration.
Okay.
Is joining me on this, and while I have the moment, I'd like to introduce Landon Farrig. Many of you know our lead staff, and also newly added Megan Alton. So if you two would, Landon's right here, and Megan is right behind
Megan,
me. So
welcome.
You'll see both of them over time, over the next 80-some days. That's great.
Okay, Director Pinsky, the floor is yours, and why don't you proceed?
Okay, first of all, thank you, and it is good seeing old faces, and not old in age, but in my former life as a recovering legislator in my role. So it's good to be back to see all of you. Support staff as well. Let's go to the next slide. All of this is a report that was called for by the governor in executive order, I think in June. We commissioned a private entity, which Ryan will talk about, to do modeling for us in our effort to pursue 100% clean energy. So this will be, hopefully, an objective report. It is not subjective. We want to put the charts, the facts, the findings in front of you, which might be useful as you contemplate legislation over the next 80-some days. So that is our purpose here today. And ahead of time, I know you only received the how many page report? 70. The 70-page report yesterday. We will be around over the next couple of weeks if you have follow-up questions. We're going to hit the highlights. The middle of the report is fairly technical, but in lay terms, we tried to make sure it was readable. Obviously, there's an executive summary at the front end and a conclusion, which pulls together a lot of the facts and findings from the modeling that was done. So let's go right into it. This shows the energy mix in Maryland over time. Coal has decreased significantly, as you can see, and the 3 coal plants are scheduled to close in 2027. The orange line represents Calvert Cliffs, which has been very steady at about a 40% clip of the energy produced in Maryland on a pretty consistent basis. Bluish line represents natural gas generation, which has risen significantly to match the Calvert Cliffs output. Together, it's like 81% of the energy generated in Maryland. That's pretty important. I mean, obviously, the other stuff I don't want to say is marginal, but compared to that 81, it's small. Solar has grown somewhat, but it's not quite where it should be. And I would say, and the chairman knows this because he was the sponsor of the bill and the RPS, there's a carve out, and we'll talk about this in a moment, 14.5% for solar. And at this point, building towards 2030, it's about a 30 to 33% behind where it should be. So again, we're here to be factual. I want to be transparent as we can. Look, hydroelectric, we're not Maine or the New England. We have 1 dam, and that's a small percentage. We don't expect to see much more. And growth in other forms of generation have been not very significant. Let's go to the next slide. This is the aggregate generation load and imports. It shows the overall generation compared to the load in the state. So the red line is total demand, and the green line is generation in state. So the gray area is basically the same as the dotted line below. It's what we import. Now this takes us up to, I can't see the slide, 23. Right now we're talking about 39%. We frequently have used the number 40% being imported. And to preview a possible question, that import is a mix of things. It's nuclear, it's gas, it's some clean energy. It's the mix that comes into Maryland from PJM, which you've just heard about. Let's go to the next slide. I want to go through this and leave plenty of time for questions. Determining best pathways to decarbonize Maryland's grid. Well, the Climate Solutions Now Act, which the committee is very familiar with, it was generated from this committee to the floor and passed 2 years ago. I was part of that effort. And it calls for a 60% reduction in clean energy, in greenhouse gases by 2031. 60%. I don't think anyone thinks that will be easy, but that is the law of Maryland as it stands. The RPS was set at 50%. Again, the chairman was very involved in sponsoring that and making changes to it. And there's discussion of moving towards 100% of RPS at 100%. And they go hand in hand. I think this is very important. The more clean energy we produce, the greater the amount of greenhouse gas we reduce it by. So in other words, if we're not using fossil fuels, the greenhouse gases go down, and the way to avoid the fossil fuels is by using clean energy. So again, they're the two signposts, the 100% clean energy pursuit and the Climate Solutions Now Act of the 60% reduction. As I mentioned, the 3 remaining coal-fired power plants are shutting down tentatively in 27. Brandon Shores, Wagner. So the production in state is decreasing. And as you'll see in a chart in just a couple of minutes, the demand is increasing for multiple reasons, including the one you just spent the last hour talking about, data centers. I mean, I think we all acknowledge that. Even with good things, if we need it for AI and other things, there are prices to pay. And I think we understand that. And there's a greater discussion going on in neighboring state in Loudoun County in Virginia as well. Ryan, jump in.
Can I just say, too, that the sort of, I think what Director Pinsky was sort of dancing around also is that there's also a greater PJM-wide potential resource adequacy issue as well that we're all, I think, trying to figure out. So this is not just a Maryland-specific problem in and of itself. It is also a PJM-wide issue. And I think just a couple of other things, too. It's interesting to note that basically the load in the state had effectively plateaued for quite some time. And in the previous graph, it's basically in a plateau, but that is definitely set to go up. And it is set to go up due to multiple reasons. Yes, data centers, but also electrification efforts as well, both building and electric vehicles. However, those amounts have basically been built into the PJM load forecast at this point and are, by all accounts, so far manageable. But just wanted to add that in for context.
And while I mentioned that we're behind in the carve-out of solar, we're also behind in the 50%. So there are challenges, you know, and this report, as I go through it, and Ryan, Dr. Opsahl, you'll see those challenges, and there are some progress. There's progress being made. Let's go to the next slide. I want to give you the assumptions. Some of you like to understand the details and what the frame was for these modeling and study. The work they did was based on 100% in-state generation. And again, mind you, we're importing 39%. So that is a very heavy lift. And we are now having them redo these modeling with maintenance of effort, a 39% import, and a 20% import. So we want to have ranges. We don't know what the future holds, whether things break open and we have new technologies. So it's very important to understand this is based on 100% in-state, which is a pretty significant move from where we are now. The model looks at costs, but also carbon emissions and reliability by feeding in things like load forecasts, current generation, retirements, queues, et cetera. Gas plants are retained in the mix, no forced closures. There's nothing in law that requires them to close, so it assumes the same gas plants that are running now will continue to run. And because the gas plants are retained, the modelers use an approach that roughly equates to an overbuild of clean generation to balance out the continuation of the use of fossil fuel. So in other words, if we want to get to net neutral or 100% clean energy, we might need, and this is, I'm throwing out a number, 120% of clean energy and 20% of fossil fuel energy, which still gets to a net 100%. So in other words, the assumption is the fossil fuel facilities will remain and will overbuild or the clean energy that will get us to a 100% number. So I think that's important to understand. And we include nuclear as clean energy. I think that's important to understand. It is not tier 1, and there may be legislation in the next 2 weeks that address that and redefine clean energy. It does not add nuclear to tier 1 or give it subsidies. But in terms of understanding, because it does not promote or put out greenhouse gases, we want to redefine it. And so we have told the modeler to use that in their review. And before we get into starting to show you some of the charts, the results of the study should be viewed as a starting point for discussion. And they point to the need for more systematized analysis of this type going forward. This is a starting point. It's a study. It's not as fully detailed, and we will need that. I mean, obviously, the conversation that just took place shows there are a lot of unanswered questions, whether data centers are behind the meter or in front of the meter, for example. Let's go to number 6 if we can. Solar and land-based wind are the least cost clean energy alternatives. But limited resource potentials with siting result in the need for additional clean energy technologies. Onshore wind, if you're in Texas or Iowa or Nebraska, they've got acres and acres of miles and miles of these. We have a small area in western Maryland where we have onshore, where the winds are appropriate before you even get to Garrett County, but it's not a large area. It's very limited. With solar, you know, we can't put solar over the city of Baltimore or Rockville or Gaithersburg. We just can't. We have a very suburbanized state, which means it's limited to areas, 1, that are open and 2, that are affordable. And I'll talk about that in a minute, which has driven a lot of it to the Eastern Shore and agricultural areas. Offshore wind, which has been discussed. There's limited infrastructure on the Eastern Shore that caps the amount of offshore wind that can contribute to serving Maryland's load. Expanding transmission capacity between the Eastern Shore and Maryland's load centers would allow for increased levels of offshore capacity in the decarbonized portfolio. We also understand 3 areas have been leased. 1, U.S. Wind, who are pretty far down the path and have suggested that 2027 it'll be up and running. The other 2, one controlled by Ørsted, one controlled by Equinor, One, there aren't any RECs for offshore wind at the moment. They were all used by, Ørsted gave theirs up, U.S. Wind took them, and given we don't know what this administration is going to do with tax credits, and without tax credits, nothing gets built. So we have two lease areas that are a big question mark, even under the best circumstance. The U.S. wind, we think, will be about 1.6 or 1.7 gigawatts. We will need achieving a net zero carbon footprint through capacity additions would require 3 to 4.5 gigawatts of additional nuclear capacity. This is roughly the equivalent of almost doubling Calvert Cliffs. And I'm going to come back to this because that's one of the major findings of the modeling, that it is the easiest and most obvious pathway to get to 100% clean energy. Cost we'll get to in a minute, and I'm going to have Ryan talk about that in a moment. But onshore wind, limited. Solar has its limits. You know, do we want to go to heat pumps? Yes, but we got to create electricity to utilize them. So, you know, Maryland's sort of locked in a small area. We don't have some of the benefits for large-scale solar or wind as the Southwest or the Midwest. So it puts us in a very difficult situation. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, I'm going to shift this to Ryan.
All right, and let me just preface this too a little bit. So we tried to make sort of realistic judgment calls on the amount of solar and wind, for instance, that would actually be available to develop in the state. We are forced to basically do that because they are lowest cost in the model. What would happen is the model is just going to spit out a bunch of solar and wind at very unrealistic levels. So we basically attempt to try and make those more realistic and then see what the model does from that point. And then there are also other points where we have to make other judgment calls as well. But at a very macro level, what the model and the modelers were telling us really is that, so at that macro level, when you start to constrain solar and wind, the model will max those out. They are lowest cost. And then there ends up sort of being a bit of a fight between offshore wind and nuclear. There's these larger capital cost energy projects. And so we, like all good modelers, they start with the base case generation mix. This is meant to be the business as usual approach in the state. What happens on current policy trajectories without any additional constraints, and the model basically just does its thing. This doesn't have a 100% requirement or anything of that nature. It's just what do we have on the books today, and what is the system likely to do at that point? And what it ends up doing is adding roughly 3.7 gigawatts. And some of that is gas capacity. Some of it is offshore wind. It's actually technically the offshore wind project, U.S. Wind. When we had actually fed this to the modelers, this was at a point in 2024 when U.S. Wind had not gone back through or started the rebid process. So they were still at roughly 1.2, so that's what we had. So that would probably be adjusted upward to 1.7 at this point. We took the PJM projected amount of roughly 2.5 gigawatts of residential or behind the meter solar. It's basically built in. You had some additional solar and onshore wind built as well, roughly an additional 1.4 gigawatts of solar and 454 megawatts of onshore wind. In addition, it also shuts down Brandon Shores and Wagner 2028, which is the expected shutdown date now that the transmission lines should be built and when those plants should actually be shutting down. So basically all coal capacity retires by 2028 in the base case mix, but also in the subsequent model runs as well. Next slide. So we have this as sort of the core decarbonization scenario.
Yeah, well, while we're going through this, actually, if anybody's any questions, we can.
It's just if you could just help for the committee what the different abbreviations are for the different fuel types that you have on there.
Sorry
'Cause
about
it's like
that.
not easy to tell what's what.
Yeah. So ES is energy storage on the very top. But then we have hydroelectric, then we have offshore wind, then wind, onshore wind. The BTMPV is behind the meter photovoltaic, which is behind the meter solar. PV, solar, photovoltaic. Then ICGT, this is a mixture of some gas, some biofuels, and things like that. You also have gas with the CC and ST, the steam turbine, and the CC is combined cycle natural gas. Then you have coal, and then the NUC is nuclear. And those are, we do have a acronym list in front. We recognize that is not ideal, so yeah.
Senator Augustine was channeling Vice Chair Kagan there for a minute. Senator Gallion, you got a question?
I knew all about the BTMPV.
Senator Gallion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good to see you to my first chair, my first term, so it's good to see you again. A couple slides back, just a couple questions before we get too far along. It said that existing gas plants will remain online as far as assumption on that.
Right.
The department, would they be opposed or supportive of new gas plants or agnostic to that? What's your position on that?
Well, again, I want to separate this report from MEA. It is done by MEA, but to do the report of what is needed to achieve 100%, we made assumptions. So that was the the gas-fired power plants remain open. There's nowhere anything about requiring closure. So we want to be very clear and explicit about that. Look, it's come up. What about new ones? We want to make sure the lights go on. And we have to come up with a transition plan, either through 2035. I mean, the resource adequacy, we don't know when the lights will start to flicker if nothing is done. We think adding new ones should be avoided if possible. Because what happens is the ratepayers will have to pay for them for the next 20 or 30 years. And when new technologies come around and we don't use the gas-fired power plants and we continue to try to reach our goal of reducing greenhouse gases, the ratepayers are going to be stuck with the bill as well as the side effects of fossil fuels. So we don't have an official position, but by and large, we think, the law of the land right now is to reduce greenhouse gas by 60%. And this flies in the other direction.
Right. And
But that's not to say they should be prohibited, because there has to be a transition plan.
Right.
And, the PSC, which appeared before us, had this hearing, and we testified. I sat next to the Senator Augustine from Cheverly. And they have not quantified when that adequacy falls short. We don't know if it's 26, 2030, 2035, 2040. PJM will not give a date or time. And that sort of ties into what our need is and where we should be investing our resources. So but we have to look at the environmental impact and the ratepayer impact. So I don't have a definitive answer. I'm not here to say, no, absolutely not.
Okay.
But I'm also not to say, rock and roll, go build as many as you can, because, again, it pulls against the law of the land.
Right, and with, potentially a bridge to, you see nuclear's already at a high percentage, and if you increase that, potentially natural gas could be a bridge to to get there
Yeah.
potentially. But
And there's another question, which we're jumping ahead. I want to give it back to Dr. Opsahl. And we'll talk about nuclear in a moment. You know, they're the big old facilities like Calvert Cliffs, like Three Mile Island with the big things. They just opened one in Georgia after 30 years, the first one in 30 years. Well, there's another model called SMR, small reactors, nuclear reactors. Depending who you talk to, it can take 8 years, it can take 10 years, it can take 12 years. We don't know. I personally, and I'm speaking for myself, I think once the dam breaks, it'll move a lot more quickly. If the big boys, and they're mostly boys, Google, Meta, all those folks, they start investing money, I think the technology and the speed with which they get approved will move a lot more quickly. But they're none in the United States right now, SMRs. There's one in China, there's one either being built in Switzerland or soon to be done, and one in Argentina. And we have a company, I think it's in Rockville, I know it's in Montgomery County, that X Energy, that actually specializes in this. So there's a timing issue. You talked about timing early on. I think the speed by which alternate technologies, including things like battery storage and technologies we haven't talked about, come on board might reflect how much we need or don't need gas.
Right. And just one other quick question, Mr. Chair. One thing that hasn't been mentioned, and I just want to see where it fits in with everything. I had a bill idea on that last year, was renewable natural gas. Is the department kind of looking at any of that? I mean, that's where you take like food waste and manure, different things, and turn that in, to energy. Has the department kind of looked at that as a way to? I know it wouldn't be a high percentage, but it would be something if we're looking at kind of more of an all-of-the-above approach.
We have not specifically looked into that. We do have in the model some biofuels fueled sort of generation, probably not at the level that we would actually want to see. I think we sort of made one of those judgment calls here to try and make a pitch to sort of broaden the clean energy portfolio that is available to the state, to try and get a little bit closer to that broader portfolio that you're talking about, that all the above approach. I think we're certainly not objecting to it. I'm certainly in favor of things like exploring carbon capture and things of that nature as well. Green hydrogen, anything else. I think anything needs to be considered, especially if we want to meet the goals that the state has actually set. So, we didn't necessarily focus on those at this point, but I think in future iterations when we need to, and I think studies like this do need to be conducted perhaps on a more regular basis. I think we would certainly look to incorporate certain new technologies as well, just to see how they interact at the system level.
Okay, we have about 4 more slides. Okay. Sorry. Well, you want to go back to 8?
Okay, shake. Okay. Back, yeah. All right, so the decarbonization scenario, this is basically I don't want to say like the main scenario, but it's sort of the main scenario where we basically just tell the model, hey, we know you ran the base case, you have that generation there. What happens if we just give you a basic 100% requirement, in this case 100% by 2035? How are you going to arrive at that core goal? And that's basically what this is. We did put in some constraints on solar and wind again. Otherwise, again, it would just spit out a bunch of solar and wind. So this is effectively what it comes out with. You get about 3.9 or so gigawatts worth of solar plus another 2.5 behind the meter as part of that PJM forecast. You get 1.3 gigawatts worth of onshore wind. they spit out roughly 3.9 gigawatts of offshore wind. And then you get about what comes out to be about a 185% increase in nuclear in this state. And what the model does spit out is basically a couple of 600 megawatt SMRs and about a 2.2 gigawatt traditional reactor. I think we recognize looking at this that, yes, this is what the model spits out, but I think it would be challenging to meet those goals. But again, that is, the model is looking at production costs and build costs and all of that and determining what makes the most sense at that system level. And so again, basically one traditional reactor and a couple of larger SMR configurations is what it comes out with. Next slide. And then so we also did some additional scenarios, and we don't have to take too long on this slide, but basically just looking at different upper limits, especially on renewables, with the understanding that, okay, if we are lagging in our goals, what could those different system configurations look like? And by and large, these additional scenarios where we have a low, medium, and high renewables deployment amount, by and large, those sort of coalesce to the extent that they could with the decarbonization model. There's a lot of similarities between the different models. And I go back to the macro, that sort of macro item that I mentioned in the beginning, which is the model tries to do the cheap stuff first, as you would expect, the solar and wind, and then you get a little bit of that fight between offshore wind and nuclear, and this is effectively what the model decided to add in each of those scenarios. And this is also where we get the roughly 62 to 93% increase in installed capacity over 2024 levels. We basically get it from these different varying scenarios on this slide here.
Okay, let's go to number 10.
Yep. Next slide.
And we'll conclude in just a moment. So if you use the 62 or 66% figure, if we're at 12, 3/4 of that or 2/3 of that means we have to build another 9.6 gigawatts of additional generation, solar, wind, offshore wind, nuclear. It's a lot, that's 1,000 megawatts. And while offshore wind creates a lot, we think U.S. wind will do about 1.6, 1.7. If the other two were to get built in a timely fashion, together, they would come in around 3.2 or 3.3, so that would take more than a third of the increased generation that we would need. So that's why the report points towards nuclear as the one area that is not constrained only by cost and speed in which you can build it. And that comes out in the conclusion. For those of you that looked at the report and jumped to the executive summary or the conclusion, they say at least 185% by 2035. And again, we understand that's a very heavy lift. And we want to pursue 100% clean energy. It might not be on that date, but we have to make strides, which leads us to the challenges. Let's go to number 11, which is next to last, I believe. Cost. I know some people are concerned about cost. We all are concerned about cost. There will be upfront cost. To build costs money. But in the out years, wind and solar are free. So we think the wholesale cost will come down in the out years. But again, upfront, whether it's nuclear, whether it's offshore wind, even solar, there are costs up front, which might lead to increases that by 2035, we'll start to see the decreases in the wholesale prices. And also, we want to be clear, the likelihood of nearly doubling nuclear energy in the next decade is unlikely. Now, as I said, for a major nuclear reactor, it took 30 years for the Georgia one to open. We are hearing a lot more quickly in terms of the SMRs. It depends who you talk to, and I don't want to throw a number out here that can't be affirmed. I have heard 6 to 10, I have heard 8 to 12, but if it is 10 years, and let's say we just did SMRs, we need a number of them, but they're smaller. I think one SMR takes like 40 or 50 acres. They suggest putting 2 or 4 together. So it's a couple hundred acres. Now, one question comes up. Conceptually, as you ask people what they think of nuclear, they say fine. And I shared this morning when I was on a panel with your chairman, I've been going around the state talking to groups, and I asked them, how many of you think your lights wouldn't go on if we didn't have nuclear? And out of 130 people, 3 people raised their hand in one group. In another group of well-informed local elected leaders, 10 out of 110 raised their hand. People don't realize we use nuclear now. 40% of our energy comes from nuclear. And I have to tell you, the people in Calvert County, like those jobs, have not had a problem. But people don't know. It does cost. And when you start talking about siting, then you're going to have another pushback. We know that. But at some point, people want their lights to go on, and if they don't, they're going to raise holy hell. So the question becomes, what do we tell them we're going to have to do to make sure those lights go on? And whether it's creating new energy, transmitting that energy, there are certain costs to doing that. And we don't know what that date is. We don't know this resource adequacy question. We don't know when it comes home to roost. So we have suggested a number of reforms. Let's go to the last slide. And I'm not going to go through all of these. A number are listed in the bill, and some will be found in legislation that you may be seeing in the next week or two. Offshore wind options. One I want to mention is right now, the REC cost was public. And that means when you bid for the RECs, you know what the top price is. A number of states have that private that the PSC knows, so you have a better bidding process with higher numbers. You have companies, New Jersey had a situation where actually Equinor pulled out, and New Jersey said, whoa, it cost us a lot of money to get to this point. So the idea of having an escrow account, if someone shows an interest, they're going to put money down in case they walk away. Solar, the ACP value in law now is slowly going down. And unfortunately, some of the companies, rather than pay the price of the SRECs, are, for want of a better term, are using a get-out-of-jail-free card, the ACP price, which is the low price. And again, we take that money, we put it back on the street for clean energy, but if it was done in large quantities by some of these companies, we get better results. We recommend, or the study recommends, a procurement process for new nuclear development, the use of clean power purchase agreements, PPAs, and also exploring new generation technologies. So this is not an advocacy. It comes from the study, from our shortcomings, from our challenges. The governor told us in the executive order to do this. It's taken a little while, but we have it. We're not done. We want to do the second 2 runs of a 20% import and a 39 or 40% import. So with that, Mr. Chairman, let us stop and take questions.
Okay, we'll take some questions. Just real quick on the offshore wind and solar, I know from the report that on offshore wind, the report suggests removing the current ratepayer caps that are in place for offshore wind. Is that, and also solar with the ACP freeze, is tantamount, to a ratepayer increase to a large extent. So how would you respond to those criticisms right off the top in terms of protecting ratepayers to the extent we can on those two component
Well,
parts?
Mr. Chairman, at the moment, there are no available RECs. We know Ørsted gave up their RECs, US Wind took those RECs, so there are no available RECs. So, the two lease areas, Ørsted and Equinor, they have nowhere to go. So we have to have a new process in place for them to be able to buy RECs to work out a financial arrangement along with the tax credits. So I'm not sure what else. I don't know if we have.
What about the solar, the ACP issue you just raised about freezing it at the current level? Because, at the outset that, the idea was in theory that the solar industry would at some point not depend on ratepayer subsidies, and that's thus the step down. And so when you freeze it, we're in effect, basically it's a ratepayer increase. I mean, again, this is as much a political as much a policy call, but I think it's an important kind of conversation just put out there.
No, it is, and I don't have a solution, but the question becomes, as policymakers, which you're in those seats, I am not anymore, the short-term cost versus the long-term gains. If we want to have more RECs, more clean energy, and it's more efficient for companies to buy RECs and do major projects, if you allow the ACP to go down, and that's where they're going to go every time. Every time they're going to buy ACP, they're going to buy get out of jail free card and not pay the REC price. And so the lower you make it, the less money that they will invest in RECs. And there's a short-term pain, but we think in the long term, it'll be a gain for our state and our society.
Okay, let's take some questions. Why don't we go the other way? We'll start with Senator Hester, then we'll go to Senator Brooks, and then we'll take whatever questions are out there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And it's great to see you again, Director Pinsky. We miss you in here. I have three questions.
Yep.
I'll ask them, I guess I'll ask all three and then let you respond. The first is, I apologize, I haven't read the report. Do we have it? Who did the modeling? And does it also include affordability and reliability in addition to the cleanliness of the energy? That's the first question. The second question is also about the report, which is whether it just kind of models how we could get to 100% clean energy, or does it also include like a strategy? Like what steps do we practically have to take to get there? For example, overcoming the obstacles in wind or solar or with permitting. And my third question is, I'm a big fan of a diversity of energy to ensure reliability and security. And so I'm curious if you guys considered, when you're thinking about natural gas, do you also consider renewable natural gas or biogas? We have a lot coming out of our landfills. Did you consider at all changing the tankers that come to the Port of Baltimore, changing from diesel to LNG as a way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And did you guys consider the effects of how much energy we need by improving our transmission and distribution network?
Okay, I'm going to give most of that to Ryan.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you so much.
More than I do on this issue, Ryan.
So the report is available. I believe it was sent to the committee. I'm not sure when. Yesterday. It is. Okay, it is.
I think I got it yesterday. Let's make sure. We'll make sure everybody gets it.
We apologize. There were some problems, and again, we'll do follow-up questions, knowing that you only had a little time to look at it.
And it is also available now on the MEA website as well. So We contracted with a group called TCR, Tabor, Karaminus, and Rudovik. These are well-known modelers in the field, and so that is who we contracted with. Can have more of a conversation about them too as well if you need to, Senator. Reliability, it does not, I know we've had discussions before about this. It does not engage in a reliability analysis of the type that you are after. What they do have is basically they will look at the capacity requirements for given jurisdictions. So the BGE, load deliverability area, PEPCO, PE. So they look at those LDAs and they say, all right, what are the minimum requirements for the capacity market in PJM? And they will sort of base reliability based off of that. But that is, in no means a true reliability study where the analysis is focused on, all right, are we going to have enough power being pumped onto the grid at this hour or this minute of the day? What happens if this, and this happens? Is it meeting these reliability requirements? So it is not at that level, but it does have some of these lighter reliability requirements. We've focused really on the modeling itself and understanding what the system and cost out and the production cost component of it, like what's going to be most competitive in the system. We focus on that mostly, so we do not have a strategy in there beyond saying, hey, here's what the model is showing, here's where we want to go, and here's some reforms that we can actually put in place that might help us get there. Is by no means a guarantee. If we enacted every single reform on there, is there a guarantee that we're going to arrive where we want to be? Not necessarily. Is a list of reforms a strategy? No. So I think that is probably an area that we would be open to working on. And then you mentioned transmission and distribution. The model does not look at that. So that would be a separate component. And that would also be a separate added piece of complexity and cost with certain projects. Obviously, certain projects are going to require more transmission or transmission new builds or enhancements of some sort. And so that is something that would have to be considered as well.
Okay, Senator Carrozza. Oh, Senator Brooks and then Senator Carrozza.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, Senator, Director Penske, for the report. It seems like the modeling company sort of followed the data. When you were looking at the various sources of the energy mix, the nuclear, I was looking at the capacity factor. And for nuclear, it's like 92.7%, and that's the capacity factor. That's a percent of time. That particular source is generating electrons. Geothermal, 71%. Natural gas, 54.4%. Coal was 49.3. Hydropower, 37.1. Wind, 34.6. And solar, 24.6. Now, I love solar. As a matter of fact, I have got solar panels on my house. But when we're looking at that particular factor, it's the lowest one on the scale, With our current situation, and especially for long term, I agree with your conclusion that nuclear has got to be a part of that equation to be able to get us to those particular goals, so that carbon neutrality that we want. So I don't know whether there was a question in that, but it's definitely a confirmation.
Well,
okay.
Let me say one quick answer to that. In terms of solar, as I said, we're behind 30 or 32% from where we should be this year in the carve-out in the original RPS bill. My staff did a study, because, again, most of it is in the rural areas, utility scale. You get much more bang for the buck than just doing it on a single residential roof. And they said that they would probably need 1 or 1.5% of tillable land, no more, to reach the 14.5%. Now, there's been some pushback in the rural area, on the Eastern Shore particularly, by some tenant farmers who are afraid their acreage will be taken away and they got to pay for their machinery. Now, the farmers, the 40% who own their own farm, they want to have options. You know, they want to either have it tilled or they want to lease to a solar company. But those who don't own the land, they want to be able to rely on that land. But again, if it's 1% or 1.5%, we think that's manageable. And I, as more than the next person, want to keep as much green space green. You know, the rural tier particularly. I fought for that on this committee for years. So we want to build out solar as much as we can within what we think is reasonable. The other point you made was,
Okay, I was talking about particularly the capacity factor of all of them, and what we're for long-term planning.
right.
Yeah,
You know, unfortunately, the more we read the study, the more it showed not our shortcomings, but our limitations. You know, we're not a big state. And solar has its limits. Onshore wind has its limits.
Right.
You know, geothermal, I think, is terrific. And we have, as a number of you know and visited, we have currently 3 carbon net neutral schools, and we have another 6 in the pipeline. But these are schools that were on the planning books, so they could put geothermal under the fields, baseball, soccer, whatever field, and use heat pumps and use solar. And those schools, those facilities, are actually producing more clean energy than they're utilizing.
yeah.
But how many new buildings are we building? So unfortunately, and in an urban environment, putting in geothermal, you don't have as much space, or you got to go down and it gets very expensive. So we're a bit hemmed in. But thank you for your comments.
Okay, Senator Carozza?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Director Pinsky, thank you for being here, and thank you for the information in the report. Throughout this briefing, there's been an acknowledgement of, I think, some of the limitations of the report with the modeling, in that, as my colleague mentioned, didn't really cover reliability, nor did it really cover true cost, which, given the situation that we're in with our Maryland budget crisis, and as well as in my district with my constituents who are asking very serious questions about, you know, the true cost benefits of offshore wind energy generation. You've acknowledged, though, that this report does not really go into the type of detail and depth that we need as a committee on those issues, reliability and the true cost.
Okay.
So on the reliability issue, I would say no, it does not go fully into depth. So what it actually does is you have generation that's basically matching, you know, megawatt hour load with megawatt hour generation. So you know that works as an understanding of, okay, can I have generation on if solar is not putting energy out onto the grid, is there something else there at this hour of the day that can be dispatched in order to pick up the load that's currently on the system? So it does that, but it does not go beyond that for reliability, and some of the reliability issues that we are concerned with do require greater depth and detail, and also, frankly, something that can model the entire, that you can use to model and analyze the entire PJM network, because obviously we are connected to the broader PJM network, and you know, that matters as well. As for costs, we put the information that we have available in the report. You know, we do have, for instance, the comparisons of the levelized cost of electricity and a couple of other items as well. But it did not. The model itself did not spit out that sort of information I think that you're after, and that's actually very difficult to figure out. I mean, if you have, for instance, a gas plant and it goes through the normal sort of situation, it will go to, you know, investors will front the money and they will say, all right, we're going to build a gas plant. And then they basically recover that based on their sales to the market. So when you then have that mixed with other types of generation that may require some subsidization, it becomes a little bit difficult, because then if you have the subsidies, then that's really on the state itself. So things get a little bit thorny there. But I think I answered your question.
Right, and I think you're acknowledging that having that additional information would certainly be helpful as we look at what our options might be. You know, you have a bullet under challenges that says offshore wind also continues to suffer delays due to increased development costs and federal uncertainty. But there's also questions about reliability and the fact that offshore wind is an intermittent source that, you know, doesn't, you know, if that's really delved into to understand that, that starts to impact where some of these other recommendations. You're already at a minuscule level with solar and offshore wind, and then it's realistically then, you know, what are you really looking at with both nuclear and natural gas? So I think that's the type of information that we will need as a committee, you know, to make good decisions moving forward.
Yeah, I would only add, Senator, that, well, let me add two things. One, if the U.S. wind does in fact come on board and is completed in 27 at 1.5, 1.6 gigawatts, that's over 1 million homes get power, over 1 million homes. And over time, because you're not paying for the wind, the cost goes down. There's clearly upfront cost. And so, you know, economy of scale is pretty important. And we have two other projects in the wings, and getting funding is important. And part of the concern is the federal uncertainty, whether the tax credits get removed. And in terms of reliability, you know, the Scandinavia has been far ahead of us, and my director has been there a couple of times to see their wind turbines and offshore winds. It has been paying off a lot, and I think offshore wind and solar in the same breath is a little different. Solar's a lot smaller. I think it is more modest in terms of what the outcomes can be and how much you can project. But the potential, if we had 3 working projects of 1.6, of 5 to 5.5 or 5.8 gigawatts, I mean, that's millions of homes having the power, which takes a lot of pressure off of other areas.
But I think this report is very unrealistic on where offshore wind development is. You know, you referenced, you know, the delays, but, you know, and kind of tying it to development costs, you know, doesn't get into the true cost of offshore wind, the cost-benefit analysis, which has not been done, and it's raising the questions of state subsidies in the future. So I think this information that you provided is helpful, but to me, it's even more of a reason to really understand the true cost involved with offshore wind compared to other energy sources. So, thank you.
Okay, any additional questions for our panel? Seeing none, thank you, Director Pinsky. Thank you, Ryan Opsel. And Landon, thanks for manning the table there, or the podium. And with that, that concludes our work for today.